Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. I was actually planning on doing this question on Black Friday, but when I started doing the research and writing the script, I thought it was a really interesting one, and I decided to push it back a week so that it could be the flagship 4-star question to lead off the month of December. Amy controls Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and she sacrifices Nirkana Revenant in order to activate the ability of Phyrexian Tower. Does Amy get an extra black mana out of this or not? Okay, so the first thing that we're going to need to do in order to answer this question is take a look at this rule here. And it basically says that under normal conditions, a triggered ability is going to look at the game state immediately after the trigger event happens in order to decide whether it should trigger or not. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, but none of them are relevant to the situation described in the problem statement. You can either take my word for that, or you can go in the comprehensive rules immediately after the one that I just had up on screen, and it'll list all the exceptions out for you. That being the case, we can say that the Nirkana Revenant needs to be in play immediately after its trigger event happens in order for the game to consider it to have triggered. That's when the game is going to be making the check to see if that triggered ability exists in the game. Now, this is probably some great news for Amy if she knows about this rule here, which says that if she's activating an ability and she needs to pay some costs, then Amy can pay the costs to activate Phyrexian Tower's ability in whatever order she wants. She can tap the Phyrexian Tower first if she wants, or she can sacrifice the Nirkana Revenant first if she wants. This means that if Amy plays her cards right, then the Nirkana Revenant will be in play at the time when she's physically tapping the Phyrexian Tower, because she would want to pay the costs in that order, and she's free to do so. So this makes Amy really excited, and it seems like this trick is going to work out exactly the way she hopes. However, there's actually one additional wrinkle here, and this is where the fun police are going to storm the building. You see, it turns out that we have this rule here, which indicates that a trigger condition that says when you tap a swamp for mana, well, the game is actually looking for a very specific event to cause that ability to trigger. In particular, it's looking for the resolution of the tapping a swamp for mana ability. It isn't actually looking for the physical action of you tapping the swamp during the process of activating a mana ability. Now, you might be wondering why this rule exists, and I'll admit it is a little bit unintuitive to have this rule that says that the trigger condition is actually something that's completely different from what the normal English meaning of those words used to describe what the trigger condition is would suggest. However, there actually is a good reason for it, and that would be that both the Nirkana Revenant and the ability that it triggers off of would be mana abilities. Let's remember that mana abilities do not use the stack, so therefore we would need some kind of special handling in order to prevent some paradoxical situations. In particular, it might be possible to get the mana from Nirkana Revenant's ability before you actually get the mana from the thing that you tapped for mana. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it could lead to some kind of weird situations, especially if you wanted to use the mana that you got from Nirkana Revenant in order to help you activate the ability, which could come up in some certain types of situations. Bringing it back to the question we were originally considering, we can say that Amy is not going to get an additional black mana here, no matter how she plays. And the reason is because the trigger event for Nirkana Revenant's ability, the thing that the game is actually looking for to decide when that ability triggers, would be the resolution of Phyrexian Tower's ability and the adding of that black mana to her mana pool. Because the Nirkana Revenant is not in play at the time when that happens, that means that Amy is not going to be able to get an extra black mana out of Nirkana Revenant's triggered ability. Okay, so that's really sad, and Amy was really disappointed to hear that. Maybe we can cheer her up by trying to come up with a different way for her to get an extra black mana. So the first thing that came to my mind was, okay, maybe we don't have a Phyrexian Tower. Maybe we'll have a Lake of the Dead. So what would happen if we were to activate the Lake of the Dead's ability and sacrifice Urborg as the swamp that we were going to have to sacrifice? And what do you think? Would this change the answer at all? So in order to answer this question, let's bring up that rule that we had on screen before that talks about how the game decides when a triggered ability has triggered. Now, in particular, we'll take a look at that last part where it says that the continuous effects that exist at that time are going to be taken into account in order to decide what the characteristics of objects that existed are. So in English, what that means is that when the game is trying to decide whether the Nirkana Revenant's triggered ability has triggered, and remember, it makes that check immediately after the trigger event, which, as we just talked about, would be adding the 4 mana to your mana pool from Lake of the Dead's ability resolving. When the game makes that check, it needs to see that the Lake of the Dead is a swamp. Otherwise, the Nirkana Revenant will not consider you to have tapped a swamp for mana. Now, unfortunately, because the Urborg has already been sacrificed at the time when we add that mana to your mana pool, that means that it is not going to be able to make the Lake of the Dead a swamp at the time when the game is performing that check. And so therefore, this trick will also not work, and it's for a very similar reason to the previous case. Alright, well, we're 0 for 2. Surely there's got to be something cool that we can do with this situation, right? What if we try one more time? And we're going to have the exact same 3 cards in our previous scenario, but we're going to change one thing, which is that instead of sacrificing the Urborg to activate Lake of the Dead's ability, we're going to activate Lake of the Dead's ability, sacrificing the Lake of the Dead itself. Remember, Urborg's making all the lands into swamps, so that should be no problem at all. Lake of the Dead will indeed count as a swamp for that purpose. So, what do we think? Will that change anything? At first, we might seem like we're in the exact same jam as we were in the previous question. However, there is actually one saving grace that is going to change things. And that would be the fact that the source of the ability that's been activated is Lake of the Dead, and that source is no longer on the battlefield. If we take a look at this rule here, we can see that once an ability has been activated, it exists independently of its source. And if we have a situation like what we have here, and the game needs to know some information about that source in order to determine whether a triggered ability should be put onto the stack, well, that would mean that we can indeed look at the source in the zone that it's supposed to be in. However, it's not in the zone that it's supposed to be in. Since it's left the battlefield, it will no longer be on the battlefield, so the game will not know where to find it. That being the case, the game is able, in this situation, to use the last known information about that source. Okay, so let's put all of that together into the situation that we're presented with. Because the game is trying to decide whether Nirkana Revenant's triggered ability should trigger, it needs to know some information about the source of the activated ability that's just been activated. Therefore, it needs to know some information about Lake of the Dead, because that's the permanent whose activated ability has just been activated. Now, Lake of the Dead is no longer on the battlefield, which means the game cannot find it in the zone that it's supposed to be in. Therefore, the game is able to use its last known information about how Lake of the Dead appeared when it was on the battlefield in order to determine that information. This being the case, the game will look at what Lake of the Dead looked like the last time it was physically on the battlefield. And at that time, the Urborg's ability was applying to it and making it into a swamp. So therefore, in this case, the game will consider Amy to have tapped a swamp for mana, and the Nirkana Revenant will be able to see that happen, and it'll give her the extra black mana, just like what we wanted. Really cool trick, right? I thought this was a really interesting question, and it definitely required a lot of research in order to get an answer that I was confident with. In particular, there still is a little bit of a technical problem. If we take a look at that rule that I justified using the last known information with, we'll see that it references the case of knowing whether an ability should have been put onto the stack. As noted before, mana abilities do not use the stack, so we still do kind of have a little bit of a technical problem with the justification. That being the case, I think it's pretty clear from the context of this rule that it was meant to encompass situations like the one that's described in the problem statement, so I think that this one should still be applicable to that case, even though it doesn't technically fit exactly under what's written in the CR. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.